The last bid echoed through the hot summer air of Redemption Creek like a gunshot, and Edna Barrett stood on that makeshift wooden platform with her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone the color of old bone. 23 men had called out their prices. 23 men had looked at her the way they looked at prize cattle at the county fair, measuring her worth in silver coins and Sunday suppers. She had smiled through every single one of those bids because her mother had taught her to smile, because the town expected it, because the whole ridiculous tradition of the box social demanded that a woman perform gratitude for being wanted by strangers. But underneath that smile was something that felt dangerously close to fury. And then she had noticed him. He stood at the far edge of the gathered crowd, leaning against the water trough with his hat tipped low and his arms folded across his chest. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a lean sort of way, dressed in plain working clothes that were clean but not new. While every other man in Redemption Creek pressed forward with their coins and their competitive hollering, this man had done absolutely nothing. He had not raised his hand. He had not opened his mouth. He had watched the proceedings with an expression she could not quite read from that distance. Not boredom, not disinterest exactly, but something more complicated. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, like quiet disapproval. Sheriff Dale Hutchins had called the final bid for her basket at $4.50, going to a red-faced cattle rancher named Gus Morley who smelled of tobacco and self-satisfaction. Edna had descended from the platform, taken Gus Morley's thick arm, and spent the next hour eating cold fried chicken and apple cake while he talked about his land holdings and the superior quality of his breeding stock. She nodded at appropriate intervals and thought about the man by the water trough. When supper was over and the lanterns began to flicker against the darkening sky, when the fiddle players struck up their first reel, and Gus Morley tried to pull her onto the dance floor with proprietary confidence, Edna had excused herself with a quiet firmness that surprised even her. She walked to the edge of the social grounds, past the decorated tables and the laughing couples, past the mothers watching their daughters, past the men refilling their cups from the communal cider barrel. She walked until she was standing in the blue-gray light of early evening, just beyond the circle of lantern glow, searching the shadows for a man whose name she did not yet know. She found him sitting on the fence rail at the edge of Old Harmon's pasture, just where the main street of Redemption Creek gave way to open grassland. He was whittling something small from a piece of pale wood, and the quiet, patient scrape of his knife was the only sound in that particular stretch of darkness. "You didn't bid," Edna said. He looked up and she saw his face fully for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe 32, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples and eyes that she could not determine the color of in the failing light, though she would later learn they were a deep, unusual gray-green that changed with the sky. His jaw was clean-shaved. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, thin and old, the kind a man earned young and carried forever. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Most men bid," she said. "It's expected. It's a fundraiser for the school." "I donated $10 to the school fund before the social started," he said. "Gave it directly to Mrs. Alderman, so my conscience is clear on that account." Edna stared at him. The fiddle music drifted across the warm evening air. Somewhere a coyote called from the dark hills beyond the town limits. "That's more than any basket fetched tonight," she said. "I know," he said. He went back to his whittling with the calm of a man who had said exactly what he meant and needed no further elaboration. Edna Barrett had been raised to be many things: polite, capable, resilient. She had survived 3 years of drought with her father's farm. She had survived her mother's death from consumption when Edna was 17. She had survived the subsequent years of neighbors and townsfolk treating her like something fragile that required managing, like a problem to be solved by the expedient solution of a husband. She had endured the box social tradition every summer since she turned 19, standing on that platform while men she barely knew assigned her a monetary value in front of the entire town, and she had never once said aloud what she truly thought of the whole arrangement. But this man sitting on the fence rail, whittling in the near dark, who had donated $10 privately so he wouldn't have to participate in what she privately called the livestock auction, this man made her want to speak honestly in a way she had not allowed herself to do in a very long time. "I hate that social," she said. He paused his knife again, looked at her with those unreadable eyes. "I know," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that was not quite sympathy and not quite understanding, but some third thing that encompassed both and went beyond them. "Looked like you did. Everyone expects a woman to be grateful," Edna said. "Grateful that men want to buy her company. Grateful she's considered valuable enough to bid on, as though the alternative is so much worse. Is the alternative worse?" She thought about it seriously, the way he seemed to want her to rather than the way most men would have preferred, which was a quick reassurance that of course not, she was only joking, everything was perfectly fine. "Not always," she said finally. "Sometimes the alternative is freedom." He nodded. He closed his pocket knife and held up the small carved thing he'd been working on. In the dim light she could see it was a horse, remarkably detailed for something made in the dark. "Theodore Bailey," he said. "I run the Bailey spread about 4 miles north of town. Bought it 2 years ago from old Wendell Pierce." "Edna Barrett," she said. "My father runs the Barrett farm southeast of town, has for 30 years. "I know the Barrett farm," he said. "Good land, your father works it hard." "He does," she said. There was a complicated truth inside that simple statement, that her father worked the land hard, and that Edna worked it beside him, had worked it beside him for years, had become as much a farmer as any man in the county, and was never acknowledged as such because she was a woman and women were supposed to be grateful for the chance to someday work some other man's land instead. Theodore Bailey seemed to hear the complicated truth. He offered her the carved horse. "For you," he said, "since I didn't bring anything to bid on and it seems rude to have nothing to offer." Edna took it. It was warm from his hands and lighter than she expected, and the detail was extraordinary: the flare of the nostrils, the ripple of muscle along the flank, the tail lifted mid-motion as though the horse was just stepping into a run. "You made this tonight?" she asked. "Started it, finished it just now." "You're very skilled." "I have a lot of quiet evenings," he said, and there was something in that statement too, something that was not self-pity but was perhaps its honest cousin, the simple acknowledgement of solitude. Edna stood there in the warm dark while the fiddle music played on behind her, and the social continued its cheerful, oblivious course, and she felt something shifting inside her chest like tectonic plates moving slowly but inexorably toward a new configuration. She had known plenty of men. Quiet men and loud men, ambitious men and lazy men, kind men and careless ones. She had never met a man who donated $10 to a school he had no children in rather than participate in something he found distasteful, and then sat alone in the dark making small perfect horses while everyone else celebrated. "Would you like to walk?" she asked. He stood up from the fence rail, and he was taller than she'd thought, and he said, "Yes, I would." And they walked together along the edge of Harmon's pasture while the stars came out one by one above the wide Wyoming sky, and Edna Barrett felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something important was beginning. That had been the 14th of July, in the year 1883. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a wide valley in northern Wyoming, 50 miles from the nearest railroad, and approximately the same distance from anything that could be called civilization in the eastern sense of the word. It had been founded by a group of Mormon and Protestant settlers in the early 1870s, survived an outbreak of typhoid in 1875, a particularly brutal winter in 1877 that killed nearly a third of the livestock in the county, and a range war between the large cattle outfits and the smaller homesteaders that had left 2 men dead, and a permanent tension running through the social fabric of the place like a crack in good china, visible if you knew where to look, invisible if you preferred not to. Edna had grown up knowing exactly where to look. Her father, William Barrett, was a good man in the essential ways that mattered: honest, hardworking, gentle with his animals and his children. But he was a man of his time and place, which meant that his understanding of what Edna needed and what Edna wanted were categories he had never quite managed to separate from what he believed a woman should need and want. He wanted her married. He wanted her safe and provided for. He wanted her off his conscience, though he would never have phrased it that way, not even to himself. The box social was part of this wanting. He encouraged her to participate, to smile on the platform, to eat cold chicken with whatever man had the most silver in his pocket and the most land in his name. He meant it kindly. She understood that he meant it kindly, and she bore the kindness like a weight she had learned to carry without showing the effort. The week after the social, she found herself thinking about Theodore Bailey with a frequency that she found both alarming and secretly delicious. She thought about the carved horse, which she had placed on the windowsill above the kitchen sink where it caught the morning light. She thought about his voice, which was low and measured in a way that suggested a man who chose his words with care. She thought about the way he had said, "I know," to her statement that she hated the social, as though her feelings were not only valid but expected and perhaps shared. She did not see him for 6 days. On the 7th day, she was at Alderman's General Store, buying flour and lamp oil and a length of calico her father needed for patching the barn curtains, when the door opened and Theodore Bailey came in. He did not see her immediately. He went to the counter and spoke to Mr. Alderman about a specific type of hinge he needed for a new gate, and she watched him from between the shelving units with the focused attention of someone trying to determine whether a remembered thing is as good as its memory suggests. It was. He was, if anything, better in the daylight than in the dark by Harmon's pasture. She could see his eyes clearly now, that gray-green color, attentive and calm. He had the kind of face that improved under scrutiny, features that worked better together than they did individually, a face that would look essentially the same at 50 as it did at 30, because it had been built for endurance rather than flash. He turned and saw her between the shelving units, and a smile moved across his face with the gradual warmth of sunrise. Nothing sudden or performative about it, just the genuine and slightly surprised pleasure of a man who is glad to see someone he has been thinking about. "Miss Barrett," he said. "Mr. Bailey," she said. Mr. Alderman looked between them with the bright, calculating eyes of a man who served as the town's primary clearinghouse for gossip. Edna saw him register the warmth of their exchange and file it away for later distribution. She did not much care. "I was going to ride out to your father's place this week," Theodore said, coming down the aisle toward her with a natural ease in his movement, nothing aggressive or presumptuous. "I wanted to ask his opinion on the north pasture drainage. I hear he had good results with that ditch system he put in last spring." "He did," Edna said. "It saved the north planting. You'd be welcome to come out and look at it." She paused a beat. "Saturday afternoon, if that suits." "I could show it to you myself. I helped design the layout." Something lit in his eyes at that. "Saturday suits perfectly," he said. He came on Saturday, and Edna showed him the drainage system, walking the lines with him and explaining the calculus of slope and soil permeability that she had worked out on paper over the preceding winter. He listened with genuine attention, asked intelligent questions, crouched down to examine the channel construction with the thoughtful eyes of a man who understood practical engineering. When she told him the system had been largely her design, he did not look surprised or skeptical. He looked interested. "Where did you learn about drainage engineering?" he asked. "Books," she said. "We have quite a few and I've had time to read them." "What else have you read?" They walked the fence line for an hour after that, talking about books, about farming practices, about the peculiar challenges of Wyoming winters and Wyoming soil and Wyoming people. Her father watched them from the porch with his coffee mug and said nothing, but when Theodore stayed for supper and helped with the washing up afterward and shook William Barrett's hand before riding out in the late golden light, her father came inside with an expression she had not seen on his face since her mother was alive. the specific, cautious hope of a man who thinks something good might be happening. "Seems like a decent fellow," her father said. "He does," Edna agreed, and held the carved horse in her palm under the table so her father wouldn't see her smiling. The courtship, if it could be called that, moved at the pace that the land itself dictated, unhurried but inevitable, like the movement of seasons or the growth of deep-rooted things. Theodore Bailey was not a man who rushed. This was either his finest quality or his most maddening one, depending on the particular afternoon. And Edna spent some of those afternoons wanting to grab him by the shoulders and demand that he say plainly what she increasingly suspected he felt. But she had her own history of silence and concealment, her own years of tucking honest feelings into careful pockets where they could not cause trouble, and she understood the architecture of a person who had learned that care was safer than speed. She learned his history in pieces, the way you learn a landscape in pieces, a hill here, a valley there, the slow accumulation of detail that eventually becomes a complete picture. He had grown up in Ohio, the eldest of 4 children, on a farm that struggled as most farms in post-war Ohio struggled. His father had died when Theodore was 22, leaving him to support his mother and younger siblings through 3 years of work that had paid the debts and set the others up, but left Theodore himself with nothing but a competence born of necessity and a bone-deep tiredness, with the idea that everything he worked for should go to someone else's benefit. He had come west at 25, worked as a hand on several large cattle operations across Colorado and Wyoming, saved methodically, and bought the Pierce spread at 31 with the focused patience of a man who had been planning a specific thing for a very long time. He had been in Redemption Creek for 2 years now. He was 33. "You're alone up there," Edna said one evening in late August when they were sitting on her father's porch watching the spectacular Wyoming sunset paint the sky in colors too extravagant for any painter to risk committing to canvas. "I am," he said. "Doesn't it get lonely?" He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was considering the question honestly rather than deflecting it. "Yes," he said, "it does." "Then why stay alone?" He looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression, a vulnerability so carefully contained that only the containment itself made it visible, the way you can see a wall only because of what it surrounds. "Because lonely by choice is different from lonely by circumstance," he said quietly. "I spent a long time being the latter. I prefer to try the former for a while." "And now?" she asked, because she was tired of being careful because the summer was nearly over and she had been watching this man for 6 weeks, and she thought she knew something important about him that he had not yet said. The sunset was extraordinary, burning orange and purple and a deep rose that deepened toward crimson at the horizon. Theodore Bailey looked at that sky for a long moment. "Now," he said carefully, "I think I may have had enough of choosing it." It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal or a profession or anything that could be quoted back to him as a promise. But it was something, and Edna Barrett, who had spent years learning to read the things men did not say as carefully as the things they did, understood it for what it was. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. His hand turned under hers and held it, firmly and without hesitation, and they sat there together while the Wyoming sky went from crimson to purple to the deep, star-scattered blue of full dark, and neither of them said another word about it, because there was nothing more that needed to be said that night. September brought the harvest, and with it, a particular kind of exhaustion that was also a particular kind of satisfaction, and Edna and Theodore worked their respective spreads through the long days of cutting and binding and storing, sometimes helping each other with the heavy work, sometimes only catching glimpses across the distance between their properties. The hours were too long for much else, but on the 3 occasions when Theodore was able to spare an evening, he came to the Barrett farm and sat with Edna on the porch or walked with her in the cooling evening air, and the space between them was steadily diminishing, the distance closing by small increments that were only visible in retrospect. It was during the second week of September that Edna first heard about the trouble with the Carmichael outfit. Harlan Carmichael was the largest cattle rancher in the county, a man who had arrived in Wyoming in the mid-1870s with Eastern money and a set of assumptions about land and water rights that the smaller homesteaders found somewhere between troubling and genuinely threatening. He ran 8,000 head across ranges that overlapped, by his own casual interpretation, with the smaller properties surrounding them. He had been involved in the previous range war, though never in any way that could be proven in a county court, and he had the kind of smile that was all surface and no warmth, the smile of a man who has learned that friendliness is useful. He had also, it turned out, been trying for 3 years to acquire the Pierce spread. "He came to see me last week," Theodore told her on a Thursday evening in mid-September, his voice careful, and even in the way it got when something had genuinely unsettled him. Carmichael came with his foreman and 2 hands, very polite, very reasonable, offering to buy the spread at what he called a fair market price. "What did you say?" "I said it wasn't for sale." Edna looked at him. "He won't let that stand," she said. "He's tried to buy the Barrett place twice. Both times my father said no, and both times things went a little wrong for us shortly after. Lost a fence line to a fire in 1880. Lost 3 head of cattle the following spring in a way that was officially attributed to illness." Theodore's jaw tightened. "You think he was behind it?" "I think there's no proof," Edna said, "which is a different thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me," he said. "There's something else you should know," Edna said, and now her voice was careful too, because the next part was personal in a way that cost her something to say. "He bid on my basket tonight at last year's social. Came to call afterward twice. My father was very interested in the possibility." Theodore looked at her sharply. "I was not," she said firmly, "in case that needs to be said plainly." "It doesn't," he said, "but I'm glad you said it anyway." Something moved between them then, a current of understanding that was half warmth and half alarm, the recognition of a shared threat and a shared stake in resisting it. Harlan Carmichael, it turned out, had interests in the Barrett land as well. The Barrett farm sat on a natural watercourse that would be extremely valuable to a man running 8,000 cattle through a county where reliable water was the difference between profit and ruin. Edna had known this for years. She had watched her father navigate the pressure with the stubborn competence of a man who had worked his land too long to surrender it without a fight. But she had also watched her father age under the pressure, watched the lines deepen in his face and the worry settle into his shoulders like extra weight. The thought of Carmichael adding Theodore's spread to his ambitions, of Theodore being subjected to the same patient, grinding campaign of acquisition and harassment, filled her with a cold anger that she recognized as the close cousin of fear. "Be careful," she said. "I intend to be," he said. He paused. "But I won't be scared off my own land." "I know," she said, and she meant it as a statement about him rather than the situation. She knew this about him already, had known it from the first night at the fence rail, that whatever Theodore Bailey was, he was not a man who ran from difficulty. It was, she was discovering, one of the things she valued most about him. October arrived in Wyoming with the abruptness of a door slamming, the warm September air gone overnight and replaced with a cold that had teeth and intention. The aspens along the creek bottoms turned gold and trembled in the wind, and the sky took on that particular high-altitude clarity that made distances deceptive and beautiful in equal measure. It was in early October that Edna's father had his first serious conversation with her about Theodore Bailey. They were at breakfast, the wood stove doing its considerable best against the cold morning, and her father put down his coffee cup with the deliberateness of a man who has been rehearsing something. "Bailey's a good man," he said. "He is," Edna agreed, watching him carefully. "Seems steady, serious, knows his land." "He does. A man like that," her father said, "ought to have a family. Ought to have someone to work alongside." Edna waited. "I'm not getting younger," William Barrett said, and the honesty in that statement, the vulnerability of it from a man who was not given to vulnerability, made her chest tight. "The farm needs more than I can give it much longer," And you, he stopped, started again. You deserve more than spending your years taking care of your old father. I don't think of it as a sacrifice, Papa, she said quietly. I know you don't. That's what worries me. He picked up his coffee cup again. Has he spoken to you about the future? Not in so many words, she said. Then maybe he should, her father said. And the gruff practicality of it was entirely characteristic and entirely dear. And Edna reached across the table and pressed his rough hand briefly before standing to clear the dishes, carrying with her a complicated mixture of gratitude and impatience, and something very close to hope. Theodore came to call that Sunday, as he had developed a habit of doing on Sundays when the week's work permitted, and Edna's father made a point of leaving them alone on the porch after supper with a transparency so obvious it would have been embarrassing if it had not also been so clearly well-intentioned. The evening was cold. Edna had brought a blanket out and wrapped it around her shoulders, and Theodore sat beside her close enough that the warmth of him was perceptible. The stars above the Wyoming valley were extraordinary in the October cold, thick and brilliant and close enough to feel like something you could reach up and touch. Your father spoke to me before supper, Theodore said. Edna closed her eyes briefly. What did he say? He asked what my intentions were. A pause. In exactly those words. She could hear the faint amusement in his voice and felt a reluctant smile at the corner of her own mouth. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be, Theodore said. It was a fair question. He was quiet for a moment. I gave him an honest answer. She looked at him. The starlight was enough to see his face, and his face was serious and a little uncertain, the careful expression of a man standing at the edge of something that matters. What did you tell him? She asked. I told him that I had met a woman who was the most capable and honest and interesting person I had encountered in 33 years of encountering people, Theodore said slowly, and that I intended to ask her if she would consider building a life with me, if she felt that was something she could want, and that I hoped she did, but that I would rather know the truth than have a comfortable lie. Stars were very bright above the Wyoming valley. The cold air was perfectly still. Edna Barrett sat with a blanket around her shoulders and looked at Theodore Bailey and felt the last of the careful defenses she had been maintaining for years settle quietly, like a fortification lowering its gates not because it had been defeated, but because it had finally found something it did not need to defend against. That's the most words I've heard you say at one time, she told him. It required them, he said. Then I'll give you an honest answer in kind, she said. I have spent several years being managed and evaluated and sold at social auctions by a town full of people who mean well and understand nothing about what I actually want. You are the only person in recent memory who asked me a direct question and waited for the real answer. I don't know yet what building a life with you would look like, but I know that I want to find out, and that's more than I've wanted about anyone in a very long time. He reached over and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face with a gentleness that was somehow more intimate than anything more dramatic could have been. And then he kissed her, quietly and seriously, under the October stars, and it felt like the beginning of the only thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The complications arrived, as complications in Redemption Creek tended to do, in the person of Harlan Carmichael. It was November. 3 weeks after Theodore had spoken to her father, and 3 weeks into what Edna privately thought of as the sweetest and most disorienting period of her adult life. The period of being openly, known by the town, courted by a man she was genuinely and deepeningly in love with, when Carmichael's first real move was made. Theodore's fence line along his western border, the border that abutted Carmichael Range, was cut. 40 yards of good fencing, posts pulled and wire rolled and removed entirely, not simply damaged but methodically destroyed. 3 of Theodore's horses got through before the break was discovered and needed to be rounded up from Carmichael land, and when Theodore went to retrieve them, Carmichael's foreman, a hard-eyed man named Dex Parrish, informed him that the animals had been found trespassing and that there would be a fee for their return. Theodore paid it. Not because he accepted the premise, but because he understood the game being played and chose his battles accordingly. He came to Edna's farm that evening with the contained anger of a man who has disciplined himself not to be rash, and she could see the effort it cost him, the way the anger moved under the surface of his careful expression like a river under thin ice. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes," Theodore said. "He does this. He starts with something you can dismiss as an accident or a misunderstanding, something where confronting him directly makes you look like you're being unreasonable. Then it gets worse." "How much worse did it get with your father?" She told him about the fire and the cattle, and about a third incident she hadn't mentioned before, a legal challenge to her father's water rights that had taken 2 years and considerable money to resolve, money her father had not had to spare, and which had left the farm in genuine difficulty for the better part of 3 years. Theodore listened to all of it. "Has anyone ever taken him to court over anything that actually stuck?" he asked. "No," she said. "He's careful. He uses intermediaries. Dex Parrish does most of the direct work, and Parrish is the kind of man who has made arrangements for his own protection." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind where he knows things about the circuit judge that the circuit judge would prefer remain private," Edna said. Her voice was flat and precise, the voice of someone stating facts they have had a long time to absorb. "Redemption Creek is not a just place, Theodore. It's a place where the powerful protect each other and the rest of us manage as best we can." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been living inside this for years," he said. "My whole life," she confirmed. "And you're still here." "It's my home," she said simply. "My father's land. My mother is buried on this property, under the cottonwood tree by the east fence. I am not going anywhere." The look on his face when she said that, something shifted in it. Something that was admiration and recognition, and something fiercer than either. "No," he said. "Neither am I." They spent the next 2 hours at her kitchen table, maps of the county spread between them, talking strategy with the focused practicality of two people who had each, in their own way, been preparing for exactly this kind of fight for a long time. Edna brought out the files her father had kept on the previous disputes, dated records, written accounts of incidents, careful documentation of what had happened and when, assembled by a man who had enough surviving frontier instinct to know that paper was its own kind of ammunition. Theodore studied the files with the attention of a man who understood their significance. "Your father kept excellent records," he said. "I kept them after the first year," Edna said. "Papa was too angry." "Anger makes poor record-keeping." Theodore looked up at her with that particular expression she had come to recognize as his version of wonder, the quiet acknowledgement that she had done something that impressed him, delivered without condescension or surprise, just recognition. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should write to the territorial governor's office. Document everything, date it properly, establish a pattern. If Carmichael has been doing this for years across multiple properties, there's a pattern to document." "We'd need other landowners to participate," Edna said. "I know 3, Theodore said. Hendricks on the North Fork, the Weaver brothers east of town, and old Salazar down by the river bottom. Carmichael's been at all of them." "Miguel Salazar is a good man," Edna said. "He's been here since before most of the Anglo settlers. He knows the land and the law both." "I'll ride to see him this week," Theodore said. "Will you come?" "Yes," she said. It was not a hesitation and it was not a performance. It was the simple, direct answer of a woman who understood that this was what partnership looked like, not the managed distance of an ornament but the working closeness of an equal. They rode out to the Salazar property 2 days later, a Thursday when the frost had thinned enough to make the ride comfortable, and found Miguel Salazar at his corrals. A small, wiry man in his late 40s with sharp, dark eyes, and the patient, watchful quality of someone who has outlasted several threats through intelligence and endurance rather than force. He received them with the grave courtesy of a man who reserves warmth for those who earn it, and listened to Theodore's account of the fence-line destruction with a stillness that became, as the account proceeded, a barely contained anger. "He tried to buy me out last spring," Salazar said when Theodore finished. I told him this land was in my family through my mother's people before his kind arrived in this territory, and that it would remain so. He paused. 2 weeks later, my irrigation channel was blocked with rock and debris. My summer crop was nearly ruined. Would you be willing to document it? Edna asked. In writing, dated, and witnessed as part of a larger complaint to the territorial authorities. Salazar studied her with those sharp eyes. You are William Barrett's daughter, he said. Yes, sir. Your father is an honest man. He helped me during the typhoid year when others wouldn't come near. He was quiet a moment. Yes, I will document it. The campaign of documentation took the rest of November and into December. Theodore and Edna riding between properties, collecting accounts, having statements written down and witnessed by the one justice of the peace in Redemption Creek who was not in Carmichael's pocket, a meticulous, bespectacled man named Josiah Crane, who had arrived in town the previous year from Illinois, and who had not yet been sufficiently enmeshed in the local power structure to be compromised. It was difficult, careful work, the kind of work that required patience and precision, and the ability to hold the long view when the short view was infuriating. But it was also, in its own particular way, some of the best weeks of Edna's life, because she was doing it alongside Theodore, and what was becoming visible between them in those weeks of shared purpose was not simply attraction or affection, but the deeper thing, the bedrock thing, genuine compatibility, the discovery that two people think about the world in fundamentally similar ways and approach its difficulties with complementary strengths. He was systematic and thorough, where she was intuitive and creative. She understood the social dynamics of the town in ways he was still learning. He brought an outsider's clear eye to patterns she had been too close to see. He was patient in a way that bordered on maddening. She had an urgency that kept the momentum from bogging down entirely. Together, they made something more effective than either would have made alone, and they both knew it, and the knowledge was its own kind of intimacy. December brought the first heavy snow, and with it a slowing of everything: travel, commerce, the grinding machinery of Carmichael's harassment campaign, because even that required passable roads and witnesses who could be motivated to act, and winter in Wyoming was an equalizer that cared nothing for anyone's ambitions. Theodore was snowbound at his own spread for nearly 2 weeks, and Edna was snowbound at hers, and they were close enough that the distance felt significant in a way it had not felt in warmer months. She wrote to him. Long letters, the kind she had never written to anyone before, the kind that said the things she thought about at night when the farmhouse was quiet and the fire was low and there was nothing to occupy her hands except her own mind. She wrote about the farm and her father, about the documentation campaign and what she hoped it would achieve, about books she had been reading during the long snowbound days, about her mother and what her mother had been, and what Edna still missed about her 17 years after the fact. She had not planned to write that last part. It appeared on the page as though her hand had decided something her mind was still considering, and she read it back and decided to send it anyway, because this was what honesty required, and because she had promised herself, since the evening at the fence rail, that she would not go back to the old careful habits of concealment with this man. His letters came back through Redemption Creek's intermittent mail service, short where hers were long but dense with content, a paragraph worth more than most men's pages, specific and precise, and occasionally so unexpectedly funny that she laughed aloud in the empty kitchen and felt her father look up from his chair by the fire with the slightly startled expression of a man not accustomed to hearing that particular sound. She saved every letter. She suspected he saved hers too, though neither of them said so directly. The break in the weather came in late January, tentative and temporary but enough, and on the first day the road was passable. Theodore rode down from his spread and arrived at her father's farm in the early afternoon, with a look of such uncomplicated gladness at seeing her that Edna felt something in the region of her heart perform a somewhat undignified leap. "You look well," he said. "You look like a man who has been eating his own cooking for 6 weeks," she said, and he laughed a proper, full laugh, rare enough that it felt like a gift. And her father came out of the barn to greet him with a handshake that had acquired, over the past months, the warmth of genuine respect. They had supper together, the three of them, and afterward Theodore spoke to her father privately while Edna washed up, and whatever was said in that conversation resulted in her father coming inside with the expression of a man who has resolved something he has been worrying about for a long time and finding the resolution satisfactory. Theodore came to find her in the kitchen, where she was drying the last of the dishes, and he was carrying something in his hand, a small thing, held carefully. "I made this during the weeks I couldn't travel," he said, and held it out. It was a ring. He had carved it from antler smooth and white, and polished to a luster she hadn't thought antler could achieve, and it was set with a small turquoise stone that caught the lamplight with a deep blue-green fire. It was not the ring of a rich man. It was the ring of a man who had used what he had, and used it with considerable skill and unmistakable intention. "Edna Barrett," Theodore said, with the directness that was as characteristic of him as his height or his gray-green eyes, "I want to spend my life with you. I want to work alongside you and argue about irrigation systems with you and read books in the same room as you and know that someone in the world is keeping honest records when I'm too angry to do it properly. I would consider it the best decision I've ever made if you would agree to marry me." Edna looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at the man holding it. She thought about all the decisions she had made in her life out of necessity and convention, and the management of other people's expectations. And then she thought about what it felt like to make a decision purely from the center of herself, from what she actually wanted and what actually mattered. "Yes," she said. "I would agree to that." He put the ring on her finger and it fit, not perfectly in the way manufactured things fit, but perfectly in the way of something made by hand by someone who had paid close attention, and she thought that this was perhaps the most accurate possible metaphor for what they were building together, and she kissed him in her father's kitchen by the light of the oil lamp, while the Wyoming winter pressed cold against the windows. Spring came, and with it the resolution of the campaign against Carmichael, which arrived not with the dramatic finality of a courtroom victory, but with the practical inevitability of accumulated documentation reaching the right desk at the right time. The territorial governor's office sent an investigator in April, a thin, sardonic man from Cheyenne named Bellamy, who had the air of someone who had seen considerably worse than Harlan Carmichael and was mildly unimpressed by the local scale of corruption, and spent 3 weeks in Redemption Creek reviewing the documented evidence. The evidence was substantial. Theodore and Edna and Miguel Salazar and Josiah Crane, and the half-dozen other small landowners who had contributed their accounts, had built a record that was difficult to dismiss, and the investigator was a man who understood what he was looking at. Carmichael was summoned to Cheyenne for a formal inquiry. Dex Parrish, confronted with the possibility of individual prosecution, found his loyalty to his employer considerably diminished and made statements that were themselves illuminating. The outcome was not prison. It was the Wyoming Territory in 1884, and Carmichael had money and connections that protected him from the most severe consequences, but it was material. His water rights in the disputed areas were formally reviewed and adjusted. The range boundaries were redrawn by a territorial surveyor and recorded at the county level in a way that was significantly harder to ignore or manipulate than the informal arrangements he had been exploiting. And the exposure of the pattern of harassment meant that any future incidents would be reviewed in the context of that pattern, which removed the weapon of implausible deniability that had protected him for years. It was not perfect justice. Edna, who had grown up watching the imperfect machinery of frontier justice grind along, understood this and made peace with it. The powerful rarely suffered the full consequences of what they had done, and Harlan Carmichael would likely continue to be an unpleasant presence in the county for many years. But the immediate pressure on Theodore's land and her father's land had been addressed, the pattern documented and known, and the small coalition of landowners who had worked together through the winter had established something more durable than any single legal victory. A relationship of mutual support and shared documentation that would make future harassment significantly more costly and complicated for anyone who tried it. On the evening the territorial investigator left Redemption Creek, Theodore and Edna stood on the porch of her father's farmhouse and watched the dust of his departing buggy settle on the road north, and she felt something loosen in her shoulders that she had not realized she had been holding tight since November. "It's not finished," she said. "No," Theodore agreed. "But it's better. Considerably better," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And the evening was warm in that particular April way that always felt slightly miraculous after a Wyoming winter, the air full of new green smell and the tentative confidence of things beginning to grow. "When should we set a date?" he asked, "for the wedding?" "I thought that was the natural next topic," she smiled. "June," she said, "before the full heat of summer and after the planting is done." "June," he agreed. They were married on the 14th of June, 1884, exactly 11 months after she had found him at the fence rail by Harmon's pasture, in the small Protestant church that Redemption Creek was proud of in the way small frontier towns are proud of their markers of civilization. Reverend Aldrich performed the ceremony with the slightly formal warmth of a man who had married many couples in this territory and still believed in the institution. Edna wore her mother's white dress, altered to fit her taller frame, with the turquoise ring on her right hand during the service, and transferred to her left alongside the plain silver band that Theodore had purchased from the jeweler in the county seat for the occasion. Her father walked her down the aisle with the straight-backed dignity of a man who is doing something correctly and knows it. Miguel Salazar and his wife Rosa came. The Hendricks family came. The Weaver brothers came, cleaned up to a degree that was clearly uncomfortable for them but clearly felt important. Josiah Crane came. Mrs. Alderman came and sat in the front pew and cried in the way that women of a certain generation cry at weddings, as though each one is a personal vindication. At the reception afterward, held in the church hall with food contributed by half the women in town in the way that frontier communities fed their celebrations, someone brought out a fiddle and someone else found a guitar, and Edna danced with her husband, a word she was still becoming accustomed to, finding it unexpectedly solid and warm in her mind for the first time in front of their entire community. He was not, he admitted to her quietly while they danced, a gifted dancer. She was not particularly concerned. The way he held her and moved with her was attentive and close and careful of her, and that was what mattered, the fact of being held by a man who was paying attention, who knew her weight and her warmth and her presence as distinct and significant things. Gus Morley watched from across the room with an expression that Edna registered and filed away as irrelevant. Harlan Carmichael was not present. He had not been invited, which the whole town understood was itself a statement, and the fact that the wedding proceeded beautifully in his absence was its own small, satisfying declaration. They went home that evening to the Bailey spread, which was now also Edna's home, and which she had already spent considerable time thinking about in terms of what might be changed and improved and built upon. The house was sound but spare, a man's house, functional and clean but without the accumulated domestic knowledge that transforms a structure into a dwelling. She had ideas about this. She had had ideas about it for months, but the ideas could wait. That night they sat together on the porch of what was now their home, under the wide Wyoming sky, and Theodore put the carved horse into her hand alongside her ring, and she held it and thought about the July evening when she had stood in a circle of lantern light on a wooden platform while men assigned her prices, and about the man at the water trough who had refused, and about everything that had come from that refusal. From his quiet disapproval and her subsequent determination to find the source of it. "I found you after sundown," she said. He looked at her. "You did," he said. "That fence rail by Harmon's pasture. Worst seat at the social," he said. "Best decision I made all year." She laughed. "You weren't at the social." "Exactly," he said. "Best decision." The first year of their marriage was as good as Edna had expected and as difficult as Wyoming living generally made things, which meant it was hard and sometimes frightening and occasionally magnificent and always deeply real. They worked the land together, the Bailey spread and its grazing range, and through the summer they also helped her father with the Barrett farm, because William Barrett's health had begun to decline in the gradual and quietly alarming way that the health of hardworking old men declines, each season leaving him slightly more diminished than the last. Edna's father moved into the Bailey spread with them in the fall of 1885, because the Barrett farm was too much for one man, and the Barrett farmhouse was too lonely, and because Edna wanted her father close, and because Theodore Bailey was the kind of man who understood without needing to have it explained that this was not negotiable, and that it was not a burden. Her father spent his days on the porch reading and carving Theodore had taught him, and it turned out William Barrett had a gift for it. Fine detailed figures that accumulated on shelves and windowsills throughout the house with the cheerful profligacy of a newly discovered talent. And in the evenings the three of them sat together, and sometimes Miguel Salazar and his wife came for supper, and the house that had been spare and quiet became something full and warm and genuinely alive. Edna discovered she was expecting their first child in December of 1885, and told Theodore on a Tuesday evening after supper in the kitchen, with the directness she brought to everything, just the plain statement of fact, and the watching of his face as it received the fact, and processed it into something extraordinary joy, pure and uncomplicated, the specific joy of a man who has wanted something for a long time, and has not permitted himself to want it too visibly for fear of the wanting, and who finds in the simple announcement that it is coming all of the relief and happiness he had kept stored up and waiting. He held her face in both his hands and looked at her as though he was memorizing something. "We're going to need to build another room," was what he finally said, which was so entirely characteristic of him, the immediate practical response to emotional news, the channeling of feeling into action, that she laughed until she cried and he held her, and they stood in the kitchen for a long time while the fire crackled in the stove, and outside the Wyoming night was vast and cold and filled with stars. The room was built by April, with help from the Salazar family and the Hendricks boys and Josiah Crane, who turned out to be surprisingly useful with a hammer for a man who spent most of his time with documents. It was a good room. Theodore built it with the same care he brought to everything, solid walls and a proper window that faced east so the morning light would come in, a small hearth, bookshelves built into the wall because they had always meant to have more bookshelves. Their son was born on the 22nd of May, 1886. He was a large, vigorous, loudly opinionated infant from the first moment of his existence, and they named him William Theodore Bailey William for his grandfather, who received this information on the porch with a stillness that lasted about 4 seconds before he was up and inside, and standing over the cradle with shining eyes, and an expression that contained more pure happiness than Edna had seen on his face in years. Theodore held his son with the careful, slightly astonished attentiveness of a man, confronting something for which no amount of preparation is truly adequate. He looked at the baby, and then at Edna, and there was something in his face that had no name in any language she knew, something too large and complex for ordinary vocabulary, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face into her hand for a moment with his eyes closed. Little William Barrett, who was called Barrett, to distinguish from his grandfather, a nickname that suited him immediately and stuck, grew into his first year, with the robust confidence of a child who has never doubted he is wanted. He was a curious, active, cheerful infant who attached himself to his great-grandfather with a particular enthusiasm that William Sr. found enormously gratifying, and the sight of the old man on the porch with the baby on his knee, pointing out the horses and the distant hills, and narrating the world with the patient gravity of someone who has been around it long enough to find it interesting, became one of the daily compositions of the Bailey household that Edna stored up and kept. Her father's health continued its slow decline, but the happiness in his face continued too, and Edna believed, she chose to believe, with the particular fierce faith of a daughter who has watched a parent suffer, that the one was in some measure a counterweight to the other. In the spring of 1887, the community of landowners who had united against Carmichael found a new purpose. The range war of the previous decade had left specific legal ambiguities around water rights and grazing boundaries that continued to create friction, and Theodore, with Josiah Crane's legal assistance, began drafting a formal petition to the territorial legislature for clearer codification of homesteader protections. It was slow, careful work, the kind of work that bore fruit over years rather than months, but it was important work, and Edna helped with the writing and the organizing with the focused satisfaction of someone who has found, in middle life, what they were meant to be doing. The petition eventually contributed, alongside similar efforts from other Wyoming communities, to the legal framework that was being developed in the lead-up to Wyoming statehood in 1890. It was a small contribution, one of many, its specific origins lost in the larger movement, but Edna knew what they had put into it and what it had come from, and that was enough. The Bailey spread in 1887 and 1888 was a working, thriving thing cattle, and a small horse operation that Theodore had been developing with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. A kitchen garden that Edna had expanded into something genuinely productive, a structure of outbuildings and corrals and fencing that reflected the accumulated effort of several years of hard and intelligent work. They employed two hands, a taciturn man of Swedish origin named Lars who had worked the northern Wyoming ranges for a decade, and a young man from Texas named Emmett who was 17 when he arrived and 19 now, learning the trade with the earnest intensity of someone who had found a vocation. Carmichael remained in the county, diminished but present. He had retrenched following the territorial investigation, focusing his energies on his core holdings and avoiding the aggressive expansion that had characterized his earlier years. He was not a reformed man. Edna had no illusions about that, but he was a chastened one, and in the pragmatic calculus of frontier existence, chastened was considerably better than emboldened. Dex Parrish had left the county entirely following the investigation. Edna did not miss him. William Barrett died in the early morning of an October day in 1888, peacefully and without apparent suffering, in the east-facing room that Theodore had built for the baby, and that had been quietly rearranged over the intervening years to accommodate the old man's presence. Edna had been with him through the night and was holding his hand when he went, and she sat for a long time afterward in the quiet room with the early light coming through the east window, not crying but present with the fact of it in the deep, wordless way of a grief that has had time to prepare itself. Theodore found her there in the morning light and sat with her without speaking for a long time, and when she finally leaned against him and let the tears come, he held her with the steady warmth of a man who understands that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a country to be accompanied through. They buried William Barrett beside Edna Barrett under the cottonwood tree on the Barrett property, where he had always planned to be, in a ceremony attended by a good portion of Redemption Creek. Because William Barrett had been in this valley for 30 years and had been, by the account of those who knew him, a fundamentally decent man, which was rarer than it should have been and worth marking. Barrett Bailey, 3 years old and increasingly opinionated about the world, patted the mound of fresh earth with one small hand and then looked up at his father with the direct, serious gaze that he had apparently inherited directly from Theodore and said, "Grandfather is sleeping there now." "Yes," Theodore said. The child considered this. "Will he wake up?" Not in the way we wake up, Theodore said. Another consideration. But he is still here. In everything he built and in the people who loved him, Theodore said. That part of him is always here. The child seemed to find this satisfactory. He stood up, patted the earth one more time, and went to take his mother's hand, and they walked back to the wagon together, the three of them, through the October afternoon, and Edna carried the grief and the love together the way you carry all the things that matter, inseparably and permanently. The Barrett farm was leased to the Hendricks family the following spring, because it was good land and should not lie fallow, and the income helped with the ongoing costs of the Bailey spread's expansion. Theodore had been developing his horse operation with the particular focus of a man who has found the thing he is genuinely gifted at, and by 1889, the Bailey horses had a small but growing reputation in the northern Wyoming territory for quality and temperament. He had a way with horses that Edna had noticed from the first, the patience, the attention, the quality of listening that he brought to human interaction applied equally and naturally to animals. She was expecting their second child by the spring of 1889 and told him on the porch in the late evening with the same directness as the first time, and he had the same response, pure joy, and the immediate practical response of thinking through what needed to be done, and she loved him for both of those things with the settled, confident warmth of a woman who knows what she has. "Another room?" he asked. "Unless you expect them to share," she said. Barrett would object strongly to sharing, he said, which was entirely accurate. Their son had definite opinions about his space and his possessions. "Then another room," she said, "and perhaps larger bookshelves." The second child was a girl, born in November of 1889, 4 weeks before Wyoming achieved statehood. They named her Eleanor Me Bailey Eleanor for Edna's mother, Me for Theodore's, and she arrived in the world with a completely different temperament than her brother, quiet and watchful and possessed of large gray-green eyes, exactly the shade of her father's, that tracked everything with a focused interest that made Edna think of Theodore at the fence rail, that same quality of attentive observation. Barrett, aged 3.5, regarded his new sister with the serious consideration he brought to most things, and then announced that she was acceptable, which Theodore received with the gravity it deserved. December arrived and Wyoming was a state now, something that felt significant in the way that formalities can feel significant when the underlying reality has been building toward them for years. Not a sudden change, but an acknowledgement of a change already accomplished. Edna sat in her kitchen on the evening of the statehood announcement, with Eleanor sleeping in the cradle and Barrett asleep in his room and Theodore across the table reading the territorial, now state newspaper, and she thought about the box social in July of 1883 and everything that had followed from it, and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that has accumulated into something solid and true. "What are you thinking?" Theodore asked without looking up from his paper, because in 6 years he had developed the particular peripheral awareness of a man who notices when his wife's silence has shifted quality. "I'm thinking about the fence rail," she said. He lowered the paper. "Harmon's pasture. You were whittling," she said. "I walked over and said you hadn't bid." "You did," he said, very directly. "I had been standing on a platform being valued in silver coins," she said. Direct seemed appropriate, he smiled. It was the sunrise smile, gradual and warm, the one that had not changed in 6 years. "I had been sitting in the dark disapproving of the whole proceeding," he said. Direct was exactly right. "I'm glad you were there," she said. "I'm glad you found me," he said. She reached across the table and he gave her his hand, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen, while the new Wyoming winter pressed against the windows and the children slept, and the house settled around them with the good, solid sound of something built to last. The years that followed were full ones. The horse operation grew into the primary business of the Bailey spread by 1891, with a particular line of working ranch horses that had established a reputation across 3 counties. Theodore hired an additional hand, and then another, and the property expanded by 40 acres when the adjacent plot came available, and they had the resources to acquire it. and Edna managed the accounts and the documentation with the systematic precision that Theodore had always relied on, and that she had always, privately, considered her strongest practical contribution. She also helped found a proper lending library in Redemption Creek in 1891, a project that had been germinating for some time, and that came to fruition through a coalition of the town's women that Edna found herself leading somewhat inadvertently, having made the organizational error of being the person who mentioned the idea in a room full of people who immediately agreed with it. The library occupied 2 rooms above the hardware store and held, within its first year, nearly 400 volumes contributed by the community and supplemented by purchases made with fundraising money and a modest territorial education grant that Josiah Crane helped them secure. It was the library that, in an unexpected way, resolved the last major thread of the Carmichael difficulty. Harlan Carmichael's eldest daughter, a sharp-minded young woman of 22 named Cecilia Carmichael, who was nothing like her father except in intelligence, became a regular patron of the lending library in 1892. She and Edna developed a careful, initially tentative friendship that was built on the shared ground of books and the shared experience of being women whose capabilities were consistently underestimated, and which both of them navigated with the awareness that the friendship existed across a fault line that had caused real damage. They never directly discussed that damage. They also never pretended it had not occurred. It existed between them as an acknowledged thing, the history of what Cecilia's father had done, and what Edna and Theodore had done in response, carried in the careful politeness of their early interactions and the gradual warming that came as Cecilia made clear, through action more than statement, that she was not her father and had her own judgments about what he had done. Harlan Carmichael died in 1894 of a heart ailment that had been developing for some years, and his death was reported in the Redemption Creek Gazette with the measured neutrality that the newspaper reserved for complicated men, noting his land holdings and his tenure in the county without editorializing on the remainder. Edna read the notice and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, but was something complex and final, the recognition that a chapter had closed. She told Theodore about it over breakfast, and he listened and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Is that all right, the way you feel about it?" "I think so," she said. "It is not simple, but it is honest." "Good enough," he said, and meant it. Barrett Bailey at 9 was a compact, energetic boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes, and a personality that was entirely his own, inventive and practical in equal measure, with a particular gift for mechanics that he demonstrated by disassembling and reassembling every piece of equipment on the property that was small enough for him to get his hands on. He had also developed, to Theodore's considerable pride and Edna's resigned amusement, a talent for wood carving that was already more advanced than most adults managed. Alina at 5 was her father's shadow in the mornings, following him to the corrals with the focused attention that was her defining characteristic, watching the horses with a quality of observation that Theodore recognized and encouraged. She could name every animal on the property by temperament before she could read, and what she noticed about the horses she carried with her into everything else. The patient watchfulness, the understanding that things reveal themselves if you give them enough time and attention. In the spring of 1895, a third child arrived. Theodore Bailey, Jr., called Theo from his first week, who arrived loudly and early and with immediate strong opinions, who had Edna's quick energy and Theodore's stubbornness, and his grandfather Barrett's gift for carving, which he discovered at age 2 and pursued with the focused obsession of someone who has found their thing. The east-facing room was now the children's room, expanded twice, with 3 small beds and a shelf of carved animals that had been accumulating since the original carved horse of July 1883, and now constituted a small menagerie of considerable detail. The carved horse from Harmon's pasture still sat on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. It had been there for 12 years by 1895 and was slightly worn at the base from the handling of curious children who had been taught to hold it gently, and it still caught the morning light the way it had caught it the first morning Edna brought it home, with the same still, forward-poised energy of something perpetually about to run. Theodore found her one morning holding it at the kitchen window, looking at the light through it, and he came up behind her and put his arms around her with the easy intimacy of long years together. "Still keeping it?" he asked. "Always," she said. "I'll make you another one, a better one. I've improved." "You have," she said, "but this one was first." He put his chin on the top of her head. Outside the kitchen window, Barrett was working with Lars on a fence repair, and Alina was in the corral doing something careful with the young gray mare that Theodore was in the process of training, and little Theo was sitting on the porch step with a piece of wood and his small knife, working with the focused intensity of a child who has inherited the patience gene from his father and is entirely unaware of how remarkable this is. "I've been thinking," Theodore said. "That's usually my line," Edna said. "I've been thinking about what we've built here," he said, "what this is, and I keep coming back to one thing." "What?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was finding the right words, the precise and honest ones. "That I almost didn't go to the social that year," he said. "I was going to send the donation and stay home, didn't like crowds, didn't like the whole business of it." "What made you go?" "I told myself it was because I needed to collect something from the Hendricks boy," he said. "But I think I was lonely, and I didn't know how to not be lonely except to at least stand near other people, even if I couldn't be comfortable among them." He paused. "And then I was standing by the water trough, and you were on that platform, and you were smiling and hating every moment of it, and I thought—" "What did you think?" Edna asked. "I thought, that woman deserves better than this," he said. "I had no right to think that about a person I'd never spoken to, but I thought it." Edna turned in his arms to face him. She looked at his face, which was familiar now in the deepest possible way, familiar with the dense familiarity of something you have looked at across the breakfast table and the supper table, and in the half-dark of early morning and the lamplight of late evening for 12 years, and which still, somehow, retained the capacity to show her something new, some angle or expression she had not catalogued yet. "I deserve what I have," she said. "Which is what I wanted." "Which is the same thing," he said. "Not always," she said, "but for us, yes." He kissed her in the kitchen the way he had kissed her on the first occasion, quietly and seriously and with full attention, and outside the window Wyoming went about its large and indifferent business. The hills and the sky and the grass and the horses, and the children worked and carved and did the patient learning of being alive, and the Bailey household held together in the way that things built with care and chosen freely hold together. Not rigidly, not without effort, but with the deep structural integrity of something that was made right from the beginning. The summer of 1896 brought a drought that tested the whole county, and the Bailey spread got through it by the drainage work that Edna and Theodore had improved and expanded over the years, and by the water storage system that Theodore had built in the 2 years following the investigation of 1884, which he had built thinking ahead to exactly this kind of year. The Hendricks farm, now run by the younger Hendricks son, struggled more significantly, and Theodore and Edna provided water access from their reserve storage through the worst of the dry months, which was the right thing to do, and also the continuation of a tradition of mutual support that had been one of the genuinely good things to come out of the Carmichael years. The Salazar family, Miguel and Rosa, celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary that summer, and the Baileys attended with all 3 children dressed in their best and contributed a carved wooden piece by Theodore, a pair of horses, this one, and an apple cake by Edna, and the evening was full of music and good food and the particular warmth of a community that has survived things together and is marking the fact of survival with appropriate appreciation. Miguel Salazar took Theodore aside at some point in the evening and told him, with the directness of a man who says what he means, that the work they had done together in 1883 and 1884 had made it possible for the Salazar family to still be on their land, and that this was not a small thing and that he was grateful. Theodore received this with his characteristic directness. "It was right to do," he said. "Many right things do not get done," Miguel said. "Yours did." Theodore thought about this later, on the drive home with Edna beside him on the wagon seat and the children asleep in the back. The Wyoming night enormous and brilliant around them. "Salazar said something tonight," he told her. She listened while he repeated it. She was quiet for a moment. "He's right," she said. "Many right things don't get done." "Is that what we were doing when we started the documentation campaign?" "We were protecting ourselves," Edna said honestly. "But yes, also doing a right thing. The two are not mutually exclusive." "You always find the honest version," he said, and the admiration in it was real and undimmed by 12 years of familiarity. "It's less work than the dishonest one," she said, "in the long run." He reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat the way he had taken her hand on the porch railing in 1883. First contact, the original gesture, and she held it the way she had always held it since, firmly and without hesitation. Barrett Bailey, now 11, was building a mechanical grain sorter in the barn in 1897. He had, with his father's patient assistance, designed a working model from wood and wire, and had been refining it through the summer with the methodical intensity that was entirely characteristic of him. It did not work yet, but the principles were sound, and Theodore had told him with the honesty he brought to everything, including fatherhood, that the principle being right was the most important thing, and that the mechanics would follow with sufficient work. It worked in September, sorting beans by size with a reliable consistency that delighted Barrett in a way that was all the better for being earned. Theodore stood in the barn watching his son demonstrate it and felt something in his chest that he recognized. Now, as the particular pride of seeing your child exceed you, the pride that is also and necessarily a kind of joy. Eleanor was 9 and had, in addition to her gift with horses, developed a voracious reading habit fed by the Redemption Creek Lending Library, which her mother had helped found, and which Eleanor treated as a personal resource of unlimited value. She read everything, indiscriminately and quickly, and retained most of it in the attentive way that suggested her grandfather's patience and her mother's precision working together in a new configuration. Theo at 2 was chaos in small form. Theodore claimed this was Edna's contribution to the child's character, and Edna declined to contest the attribution on the grounds that it was largely accurate. In the last years of the 19th century, as the century that had defined the frontier experience moved toward its close, Edna and Theodore Bailey worked their land and raised their children and contributed to their community with the steady, accumulated competence of people who had been doing these things long enough to do them well. Redemption Creek had grown a proper hotel now, a doctor, a dentist, a school that had expanded to 2 rooms and a dedicated schoolteacher who had come from Ohio and stayed, a telegraph line, and the railroad a day's ride away now instead of 2. The world was changing. The open range was closing. The cattle drives that had shaped this territory for 30 years were giving way to different patterns of land use and economy, and the massive operations like the old Carmichael outfit were themselves fragmenting and changing as the Carmichael children divided their father's holdings according to their own visions and interests, none of which replicated his particular combination of ambition and aggression. The Barrett farm continued under the Hendricks lease until 1898, when Edna and Theodore made a decision that had been forming for some time. They purchased the Barrett property outright, incorporating it into the Bailey operation, and planted the eastern fields in ways that integrated with their horse operation and their expanded grazing management. The cottonwood tree by the east fence still stood, and the graves of William and Eleanor Barrett still rested beside it, tended and marked and visited. Edna went there alone sometimes, in the early mornings when the light was particular. And she did not feel grief primarily, but something more complex and ultimately more gentle, the continuing presence of people who had shaped her, and the quiet recognition that she had honored them by making something real and true of the materials they gave her. She was 38 in 1902, and her husband was 42, and the Bailey property was 210 acres of good working land with a house that had been expanded twice, and a barn that was entirely rebuilt after the original one proved insufficient for the scale of operations, and a reputation for honest dealing and quality horses that extended well beyond Sweetwater County. They had built this together from the ground up, from nothing more than a shared disposition toward directness and a mutual recognition that they were, each of them, better with the other than without. On a July evening in 1902, Theodore came in from the corrals to find Edna at the kitchen table with the familiar spread of papers that indicated she was working on accounts, and he came and looked over her shoulder at the numbers for a moment. "We're doing well," he said. "We are," she agreed. He went to the kitchen window and picked up the carved horse from its windowsill, 19 years old now, worn smooth with handling, the fine details slightly softened with time but the essential form unchanged, the forward energy still readable in every line of it. "I still can't believe you kept this," he said. "I still can't believe you made it in the dark," she said. "I was showing off," he admitted. "I didn't know who for at the time, in retrospect clearly for you," she laughed. He put the horse back on the windowsill exactly where it had been in the exact spot where the morning light would catch it. He sat down across the table from her. "Barrett said something to me this morning," he said. "What did he say?" "He said he wants to learn the horse trade properly. Train horses, not just work them." He paused. "He said he's been watching the way I work with them, and he thinks it's the thing he wants to do." Edna looked at her husband's face and saw what it cost him to say this without the emotion showing, the contained, profound joy of it. "You've been hoping for that," she said. "I've been hoping for that," he confirmed. "How did you answer him?" "I told him to be at the corral tomorrow at 5:30 in the morning and we'd start." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand under hers and held it, and the gesture was exactly what it had always been. The first gesture, the original one, repeated across 19 years without losing any of its meaning, which was everything they were to each other stated simply, and completely without the need for elaboration. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming evening was settling into the long late summer dusk, the sky going through its extravagant colors, the hills going dark against the last light. Barrett and Edna and Theo were somewhere on the property doing the particular things they always did at this hour, Barrett in the barn, Edna with the horses, Theo probably in the wood shop that Theodore had built for him last spring, and which he treated with the reverent seriousness of a dedicated practitioner. The house was full and warm and alive with the presence of people who belonged to each other in the best possible way, not through obligation or convention or the livestock auction logic of the box social, but through choice, continued and renewed every day. The choice that Theodore Bailey had made when he refused to participate in a transaction he found distasteful and sat in the dark on a fence rail instead. And the choice that Edna Barrett had made when she walked out of the lamplight into the dark to find the only man who hadn't bid. That was the thing about choices, she thought, looking at the carved horse in the window light. One right choice, made honestly and from the real self rather than the performed one, could change everything that followed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, accumulated, irresistible way that water changes stone, patient and persistent, and ultimately transforming the entire landscape. She was still holding Theodore's hand across the kitchen table when Edna came in from outside with the news that the young gray mare had shown the first signs that she was ready to be ridden. And Barrett came in behind her with the absorbed energy of a boy who has spent his day making something work. And Theo came trailing after with wood shavings in his hair and a new small carved figure in his hand, that he presented to his mother with the formal gravity of a significant offering. It was a woman. Small and detailed, the woman's figure standing straight and clear-eyed, her hands at her sides and her chin lifted. "It's you," Theo said. "I've been practicing." Edna took the small carved figure and held it alongside the horse in her palm. The horse Theodore had made on the evening they met, and the figure her youngest child had made of her. And she felt the weight of them together, light as carved wood, heavy as everything they represented, and looked around her kitchen at her family gathering for the evening, the big competent children and the steady, beloved man across the table, and felt the full, undefended truth of her own happiness settle into her like a long breath finally released. "It's wonderful," she told Theo, and meant it in every possible sense. The Wyoming sky outside went purple and then dark, and the stars came out as they always did over that valley. As they had come out on the evening, she had found a man at a fence rail who had refused to put a price on her, and they sat down together to the evening meal, all of them, in the warm light of their own home. And it was, by any honest measure, exactly enough.